So we're picking up in our middle class America lecture with the age of reform. And I just want to mention two of the reform movements that aren't mentioned on this slide, not because they weren't as important, but just because they were lesser known. And one of them was rather than placing people who were mentally and physically disabled in like a prison, people began to move that those people be placed in mental institutions. And it's important to keep in mind that even though they were placed in mental institutions instead of prisons, by today's standards, they were still very much prison-like. But there was a beginning of a movement to reform conditions for the mentally ill. And another reform that took place was with criminals. And criminals were seldom locked away for extended jail terms. Most of the time they were whipped or beaten or placed in stocks in the town square, or for more serious crimes, of course, they were executed. But as reformers began to point out that the reason that people committed crimes had a lot to do with their surroundings and how they were raised, there was a movement to put people in prison and to try to rehabilitate them. So the temperance movement, this was the largest and probably the most successful movement at the time. And this movement addressed a legitimate problem of lots and lots of men coming home from work, spending all of their money at the saloon, getting ridiculously drunk, and then coming home and beating the wife and the children. And this was a widespread problem. And so many women, even though the cult of domesticity says that the woman needs to stay in the home, many women took on a public role with the temperance movement because they were doing it for the protection of their families. So the temperance movement was just an effort to decrease the amount of alcohol or alcoholism in America. And so Americans in the 1820s, by and large, consumed prodigious quantities of alcohol. And so one of the first unions to try to put a stop to this was the American Temperance Union. And this was started in 1826. And it marked the beginning of a national crusade against drunkenness. Like I said, women were at the center of this movement. And like I said, even middle-class women who thought that their place was in the home could argue that a husband who squandered his earnings on alcohol and came home drunk imperiled the family. Therefore, she took on a public role. There was some opposition to the temperance movement, even though it was a large movement. Even leaders of the nation, like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, were heavy alcohol consumers. And Webster is said to have had several thousand bottles of wine, whiskey, and other alcoholic beverages in his cellar. There were artisans and middle-class workers who regarded their twice daily dram of whiskey as a part of their wages. The temperance movement was really unpopular with German and Irish immigrants, and even by some Protestant churches who used wine in communion, didn't want to be told that they couldn't use wine in their church service. But despite that, by the 1840s, reformers had secured legislation imposing a licensing system for alcohol and taxes on alcohol. And by 1851, Maine passed the first effective law prohibiting the sale and manufacture of liquor. And just within 4 years, about 12 other states had followed Maine's example. So as a whole, the nation's per capita consumption of alcohol plummeted. The next important reform movement was abolitionism, and this movement was aimed at outlawing slavery. And this really attracted few followers until around the 1820s. So even anti-slavery Northerners considered slavery wrong, but they believed that the Constitution made them tolerate it in the states where it existed. So they really didn't fight against it because they felt like it was constitutional. Advocates of forced abolition were regarded as extremists and irresponsible. So therefore, most of the critics of slavery confined themselves to either urging colonization in Africa or just persuading slaveholders to treat their slaves humanely. One of the main abolitionists was William Lloyd Garrison, and he demanded the immediate emancipation of all slaves and full racial equality. He was pretty ineffective, though, because one, he was unyielding on his position, and two, he refused to engage in politics. So, he believed that since the U.S. government permitted slavery, he would not be a part of the government or politics at all. So he didn't really get very far. Another prominent black abolitionist was Frederick Douglass, who was a former slave who had escaped from Maryland, and he also insisted on emancipation as well as full social and political equality for slaves. And he was a little more successful because he wasn't so unyielding. So women's rights was another aspect of the reform movement in the 1850s. And this really stemmed from abolitionism. Women who opposed slavery usually confronted the opposition of men who objected to them participating in political affairs. And many of those men didn't like that women were in the public at all. Therefore, many female abolitionists also became advocates for women's rights. And some women even equated women's position in society with that of blacks. Just to throw some names at you, the advocates of women's rights were Sarah and Angelina Grimke, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And Stanton and Mott and some other women organized a meeting at Seneca Falls in 1848, and they drafted their own Declaration of Independence. It was even modeled on the Declaration of Independence, and it was just a statement of women's rights. Declaring their independence from men, I guess, but it was called the Declaration of Principles. Susan B. Anthony became the leading reformer for women's rights in the 1850s, and she recognized very clearly early on that she would need effective organization in order to put pressure on this male-dominated society. But even with her efforts and the efforts of others, feminists were not able to achieve huge results in the era of reform. Romanticism. Romanticism and the Romantic movement was really just a reaction against the Age of Reason. Romantics valued emotion and intuition over pure reason. And in that, they stressed individualism, optimism, patriotism, ingenuousness. And this was part of the reason that attitudes of parents toward their children began to shift. And rather than believing that children were born in original sin and they were just rotten to the core, they believed that children were born perfectly and later corrupted by society. A part of this movement was the Transcendentalist movement, and this was just a mystical, intuitive way of looking at life that wanted to go beyond the world of the senses. And this really represented the fullest expression of Romanticism. They regarded nature as the essence of divinity, and they believed that humans were divine because they were a part of nature. And above all, Transcendentalists valued the individual and the aspiration to stretch beyond human capabilities. So this really came with a dose of humanism. So we'll take a look at some of our American authors. Emerson especially and Thoreau also were leading transcendentalist thinkers. Ralph Waldo Emerson urged Americans to put aside their devotion to European things and instead to seek inspiration in their immediate surroundings. And he did this, he came up with this after traveling to Europe. Although he favored change and he believed in progress, the new industrial society in New England disturbed him, and he valued self-reliance and disliked powerful governments and industry. Sadly for him, the world as it existed repelled him so much that he did not actively try to change it. So even though he was bothered by powerful governments and the effects of industry in the North, he didn't really do anything to change it because he didn't like the world as it was. So he neglected to try to influence it. Like Emerson, Henry David Thoreau also objected to society's restrictions on the individual. Thoreau spent 2 years living alone in a cabin at Walden Pond to prove that individuals do not need to depend on society. And to protest the Mexican War, which he thought was immoral because it advanced the cause of slavery, he actually refused to pay his state toll tax, for which he ended up in prison for one night. His essay, Civil Disobedience, explains his view on the proper relationship of the individual to the state. But like Emerson, Thoreau didn't really participate in reform movements. Edgar Allan Poe. He was born to 2 actors that died before he was 3 years old. So he was raised by a wealthy Virginian named John Allan. So Poe was so, grateful of John Allan raising him that he added Allan to his name. And Poe really epitomized the romantic image of the tortured genius. And if you've read any of his stuff, you know that he's obsessed with death and darkness. And this was because he was plagued by alcoholism, bouts of melancholy, hallucinations, and even debt, which was sad since he was a master short story writer and poet, and also an excellent magazine editor. But some of his detective stories are The Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Purloined Letter. And although he died at 40 years old, he still managed to produce a large volume of serious and highly original work. Nathaniel Hawthorne was another important American author. He was born in 1804 in Salem, Massachusetts, and he found the egoism and the optimism of the Transcendentalist movement a little bit obnoxious. So the thing that he was most fascinated with was New England's Puritan past and how that Puritan past continued to influence his time and his place, which was Massachusetts. So his best-known works, The Scarlet Letter and The House of Seven Gables, deal with individuals and their struggle with sin and with guilt and pride. The good thing about Hawthorne's work is that it gives a really good indication of what New England culture was like at the time. So the next one is Herman Melville, who was actually a friend of Hawthorne. He dropped out of school at 15 years old, worked as a bank clerk, and went to sea in 1837 for a year and a half. And interestingly, he lived with a tribe of cannibals in Marquesas after he jumped ship in the Pacific Ocean near Australia. And his accounts of this were really popular. Like Hawthorne, Melville didn't really like the Transcendentalist optimism, and he considered their talk about striving and their faith in the goodness of humanity nonsense. And so in his famous work, which is Moby Dick, he dealt powerfully with the problems of good and evil, courage and cowardice, faith, stubbornness, and pride. Walt Whitman. Whitman actually walked around as a kid with Emerson's books in his lunchbox. And he turned out to be the most romantic and probably distinctly American writer of his time. So Whitman believed that a poet could best express himself by relying uncritically on his natural inclinations. And so his greatest work, called Leaves of Grass, often shocked and confused his readers with its commonplace subject matter and its coarse language. And he loved to throw in foreign words and usually sounded pretentious and foolish when he did, but was nevertheless popular for it. So that brings us to reading and the dissemination of culture. As the population grew and became more concentrated, and as middle-class values permeated American society, especially in the North, popular concern for, quote-unquote, culture increased. And so improved printing techniques reduced the cost of books, magazines, and newspapers. And this was largely how the dissemination of culture took place, was in books, magazines, and newspapers. And so moralistic, like domestic novels, reached their peak of popularity in the 1850s. And Americans also devoured religious literature during this time. Self-help books were really popular. Philanthropists spent their money establishing libraries and public lecture halls. So this was just an age when people devoured literature. Education. So the reform in education that took place was spearheaded by a guy named Horace Mann, and this is almost always the name you see when you look at school improvement in the 1850s. And he led the Common School movement and urged the creation of state chartered schools that were taught by professional teachers with actual credentials. And this movement was based on the idea that the human race could be improved through education, and a belief that in order to have a successful democracy, you had to have educated citizens. And so by the 1850s, every state outside of the South provided free elementary schools and supported institutions and colleges to train teachers. Part of the success of this movement was that it instilled good employee values. That was a core part of this education, teaching integrity and good character traits. But common schools also helped to, quote, Americanize immigrant children. And they were able to bring Americans of different economic circumstances and ethnic backgrounds into an early and mutually beneficial contact with one another. So looking at the state of colleges, the cost of private colleges was astronomical, and there were relatively few students who could afford the cost of private collegiate institutions. So since these students were hard to come by, discipline and academic standards were kind of lax. So the college curriculum focused on the classics rather than practical or scientific studies. And this began to change in the 1840s when they began to reform the curriculum and add more sciences to college curriculums. So Harvard and Yale both established schools of science, and Harvard allowed students to choose some of their courses even, and begin to institute grades, an actual grading system. Colleges in the South and in the West began to offer mechanical and agricultural subjects, which was extremely important in the South and the West. Oberlin College admitted women in 1837, and there was another female college, the Georgia Female College, which opened in 1839. But by and large, white males constituted the overwhelming majority of students during this time. But even in spite of all that, only about 2% of white males in America went to college by the 1850s.